When I was growing up in the mid-2000s, I was never what you would call a popular kid. I wasn't an outcast, and I didn't suffer through severe bullying or anything tragic like that. I was just entirely invisible. I was the quiet kid who sat in the back of the class, completely bypassed when invitations to weekend parties or social gatherings were handed out. And honestly, I was completely fine with that. My parents were strict. Not just ordinary, protective parents, but strict to a level that bordered on psychological annoyance. They enforced a rigid military-like routine upon my life. I was rarely, if ever, permitted to leave the house for social events, so the fact that I wasn't being invited to massive high school parties actually spared me a lot of exhausting arguments at the dinner table. Throughout my entire high school experience, I had exactly one true friend, a guy named Ethan. Our friendship thrived largely because his parents were even more authoritarian and strict than mine. On the incredibly rare occasions where I was actually granted permission to do something outside of school hours, it was strictly on the condition that I was hanging out with Ethan, because our parents mutually trusted each other's strict environments. During the spring semester of our senior year, a massive opportunity presented itself. My parents announced that they were going to be traveling out of state for a 4-day weekend to attend a family reunion. Even though I was 18 years old at the time and legally an adult, my parents were deeply uncomfortable with the concept of leaving me completely unsupervised in the house. To me, it felt utterly ridiculous, but I knew better than to argue against their parenting style. Instead of throwing a tantrum, I spent weeks leading up to their departure executing a careful negotiation strategy. I begged them to let me stay home, offering a compromise. I would invite Ethan over to spend the entire weekend at our place. I promised them that we wouldn't leave the house, we wouldn't invite a single soul over, and we would spend the entire weekend locked in the living room playing video games. Did your parents have strict rules growing up, or did you have total freedom? Tell me your craziest childhood rule in the comments below. I know that for the vast majority of teenagers, an empty house for a 4-day weekend is the ultimate, classic, cliché setup for a massive, destructive high school rager. But Ethan and I were genuinely different. I was 100% serious about our plan. We had zero interest in alcohol, drugs, or parties. We literally just wanted to eat junk food and play PlayStation without anyone hovering over our shoulders. To my absolute shock, my parents finally relented. For the first time in my 18 years of life, as I watched their car pull out of the driveway that Friday afternoon, I felt a genuine, intoxicating shred of true independence. But that feeling was about to take an incredibly dark, unforgettable turn. Ethan arrived at the house an hour after my parents left, carrying a duffel bag stuffed with extra controllers and snacks. That Friday night was exactly what we had dreamed of. We ordered a massive mountain of pepperoni pizza and garlic wings, dimmed the living room lights, and booted up Chronicles of the Kingdom 2, a deeply nostalgic action RPG that we had both played obsessively during our childhood. We lost all track of time. Somewhere deep into the early morning hours, the heavy quiet of the house was shattered by the loud, jarring sound of the front doorbell ringing. The sound completely startled both of us. We physically jumped in our seats. When you are isolated in a quiet suburban home late at night, completely unexpecting company, the sudden blare of a doorbell sends an immediate, icy spike of adrenaline straight through your chest. We froze, staring at each other. Ethan immediately whispered that it was probably just a random mistake, maybe some drunk teenagers walking back from a real party down the street, and argued that we should just ignore it and keep playing. We sat in tense silence for about 10 seconds, waiting for the silence to return. Instead, the doorbell rang a second time, louder and more insistent than before. Ethan physically reached out to grab my shirt, trying to hold me back from the door, but a wave of anxiety washed over me. My mind immediately raced to the worst-case scenario. What if my parents had been in a horrific car accident on the highway, and the state police were standing on my porch to deliver the news? I pulled away from his grip and walked slowly, hesitantly down the long carpeted hallway toward the front door. During my incredibly slow, agonizing crawl down the hall, the doorbell rang a third time. 3 distinct, calculated rings. This was absolutely not a random mistake or an accidental bump. Somebody was deliberately standing on my porch, demanding that the door be opened. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I reached the entryway and stood before the heavy wooden front door. I took a deep breath, consciously reminding myself that even if I opened this main door, the heavy metal screen door on the outside was locked tight with a deadbolt. I grabbed the brass handle, turned it, and swung the wooden door fully open. I locked my eyes through the glass panels of the screen door, fully prepared to confront a police officer or a stranger. There was absolutely nobody there. The porch was bathed in the harsh yellow glow of the overhead light, completely empty. I pressed my face close to the screen window, scanning the front yard, the driveway, and the dimly lit suburban street. There was no one running down the sidewalk, no vehicles idling with their lights off, and no signs of movement whatsoever across the property. From the living room, Ethan shouted down the hall, frantically asking who it was. I couldn't even find the words to answer him right away. For a fleeting second, I contemplated unlocking the screen door, stepping out onto the dark grass, and walking around the perimeter of the house to investigate. But my fundamentally cautious, easily frightened nature got the better of me. I stepped back, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, locked the deadbolt, and walked back into the living room. I told Ethan that it must have been a cruel prank, because the porch was entirely deserted. Needless to say, the relaxed, joyful atmosphere of our weekend was instantly ruined. We were both incredibly on edge for the remainder of the night. You might think we were being pathetic cowards over a simple doorbell prank, but I guarantee that if you found yourself isolated in a dark house with no neighbors nearby, experiencing that exact sequence, you would feel a deep, unsettling wrongness in your gut. Neither one of us managed to get a single minute of decent sleep. We took turns tossing and turning on the couches, jerking awake at every ordinary creak of the house and every gust of wind against the windows. Saturday morning eventually arrived, bringing the comforting bright light of the sun. We spent most of the day outside on the back patio, soaking in the warm weather and talking for hours about school and our upcoming college plans. By the time the afternoon began to fade, the terror of the previous night had completely slipped my mind. I had fully rationalized it as a stupid neighborhood prank. That night, we heated up our leftover pizza, turned the living room TV back on, and loaded up our game save file, determined to enjoy our final night of freedom. At exactly 1:13 a.m., the front doorbell rang again. The moment the sound echoed through the house, my eyes darted straight to the digital clock on the cable box. 1:13 a.m. This was no longer an annoying coincidence. This was a targeted, deliberate pattern. A wave of cold, visceral terror washed over me, but the fear quickly turned into a defensive flash of anger. I pushed myself up from the couch and marched back down the hallway toward the entryway. Right as my hand hovered over the deadbolt, the doorbell rang a 5th time, the vibration rattling the wood beneath my fingers. I forcefully threw the wooden door open, fully prepared to scream at whoever was playing games with us. But the words completely caught in my throat. Standing on the other side of the locked screen door, completely illuminated by the yellow porch light, was an elderly woman. She was incredibly short, her hunched frame topped with a shock of stark, untamed white hair and deeply wrinkled, leathery skin. Oddly, despite the fact that it was an incredibly warm, beautiful 70-degree night, she was swaddled in a thick, heavy winter overcoat that dragged near her ankles. She also had a brightly colored silk scarf tied tightly under her chin, holding her hair in place. Up until that exact second of my life, I had never once conceptualized an elderly woman as a source of threat or terror. But seeing her standing on my doorstep in the dead of night, dressed for a blizzard, completely shattered that assumption. For several agonizing seconds, neither of us said a word. She just stood there, staring directly through the glass at me, with a wide, unnerving, completely vacant smile stretched across her wrinkled face. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was thin, raspy, and completely devoid of inflection. She asked if Mr. Walker was home. I froze, my teenage brain struggling to process the bizarre nature of the question. I took a step back and told her firmly through the screen that nobody by that name lived at this address and that she had the wrong house. The moment the words left my mouth, her wide smile slowly, methodically faded into a flat, expressionless line. She let out a soft, clicking sound from the back of her throat that sounded deeply sympathetic, like she was pitying me. Then just as suddenly as before, her face snapped back into that massive, terrifyingly wide grin. "Oh yes, that's right," she chirped, her eyes wide. "Mr. Walker doesn't live here anymore." I forced a tight, panicked smile of my own, told her to have a good night, and began to pull the heavy wooden door shut. But before the latch could engage, she spoke up again, her voice rising in pitch. She asked if Joe was still around inside. I stopped, holding the door open just a crack. I told her again with increasing hostility that she had the absolute wrong house and that I needed her to leave my property immediately, or I would call the police. The old woman didn't flinch. Instead, she threw her head back and began to laugh. It was a loud, unhinged, cackling laughter that echoed off the walls of the porch. Through her laughter, she told me that Joe was absolutely still inside the house. When I angrily demanded to know what the hell she was talking about, she stepped closer to the glass, her breath fogging the pane, and whispered that she could actively hear him whispering inside the walls right now. I didn't say another word. I violently slammed the heavy wooden door shut, locked the deadbolt, and backed away. Even through the thick wood, the muffled, manic sound of her laughing outside continued to echo down the hallway. I ran back into the living room, my face completely white. Ethan was standing up, panicked, demanding to know what was happening. I told him to grab his cell phone and be ready to dial 911 immediately, explaining that there was a completely insane, unstable woman refusing to leave our porch. Have you ever had a terrifying encounter with a stranger at night? What happened? Share your story in the comments. A few minutes passed and the laughter outside finally subsided. Desperate to see if she had finally wandered off, I crept over to the large bay windows in the living room that overlooked the front yard. I parted the blinds by a fraction of an inch and peered out into the darkness. My stomach wrenched. She hadn't left. She was standing directly in the middle of the asphalt street, completely illuminated by the pale blue glow of a distant streetlight, facing my house. It was dark, and the distance made it difficult to see her features clearly, but based on the angle of her chin, I knew with absolute certainty that she was still staring directly at my window, wearing that same grotesque, unmoving smile. We debated calling the police right then and there, but as a sheltered, intensely anxious teenager, I began to panic about the logistics. What if the police called my strict parents? What if I got into massive trouble for causing a scene while they were away? In my immaturity, I convinced myself that if we just ignored her, she would eventually get bored and walk away. At exactly 3 a.m., nearly 2 hours later, I crept back to the window to check again. She was still there. She had not moved a single inch. For 2 straight hours, this elderly woman had remained frozen in the middle of the asphalt, staring at my home. That was the absolute breaking point for me. The fear mutated into pure, unfiltered rage. I decided I was going to march down the hall, open the wooden door, and scream through the locked screen that I was actively looking at the police dispatcher on my phone if she didn't vanish immediately. I walked to the entryway and unlocked the deadbolt. But the moment the wooden door swung open, the threat of a yell died completely in my throat. The old woman was no longer in the street. The very second she heard the heavy mechanism of my wooden door click open, she dropped her posture and began to sprint directly toward my front porch at a shocking, completely unnatural speed. I cannot even begin to properly articulate how deeply, Existentially terrifying it is to see a human being of that advanced age move with the explosive, athletic speed of a professional sprinter. It defied the laws of biology. It looked completely wrong, like a corrupted piece of video footage playing at double speed. Before her heavy boots could even reach the first step of the porch, I let out a blood-curdling scream, threw my entire weight against the wooden door, slammed it shut, and threw the lock into place. Ethan came sprinting down the hallway, terrified by my scream. Before I could even attempt to explain what I had just witnessed, I looked at Ethan and realized he had completely frozen mid-stride. He looked like a stone statue, his eyes locked onto the drywall next to the entryway, his mouth hanging open. He tried to speak, stuttering violently, before he finally managed to force a single word out of his throat. The window. Slowly, with absolute dread, I turned my head to look at the narrow glass window pane that ran parallel to the front door structure. Pressing her face completely flat against the exterior glass, her nose deformed against the pane, was the elderly woman. She was staring directly into the hallway at us, her massive manic smile still plastered across her face. But what made my blood run entirely cold was her body positioning. Her spine and neck were bent sideways at an almost 90-degree physically impossible angle, allowing her to wedge her face into the frame. I snatched the kitchen landline phone off the counter with trembling hands and dialed 911, screaming our address to the dispatcher. For several agonizing minutes, the woman did not move. She just remained pinned against the glass, staring through the pane, her unblinking eyes locked onto ours. It wasn't until a couple of minutes before the actual police squad car pulled into the neighborhood that she suddenly detached herself from the glass and vanished into the darkness of the side yard. When the responding officer arrived, I could immediately tell he was deeply skeptical of our story. At the end of the day, he was looking at two pale, clearly terrified high school kids spinning a wild, borderline absurd yarn about an unnaturally fast, acrobatic elderly woman playing peekaboo through a window. I honestly couldn't blame him. If I were in his shoes, I wouldn't have believed us either. He did a quick sweep of the perimeter, took our basic statements, and left the area. Needless to say, neither Ethan nor I slept a single wink for the rest of that weekend. I spent every remaining hour fully expecting her face to pop back up against the glass the moment the police cruiser turned the corner, but thankfully, she never returned. My parents finally came home late Monday morning. Initially, I had resolved to keep the entire ordeal a secret to protect my newfound freedom. But as I sat at the kitchen table looking at them, the guilt and the lingering trauma became too much to bear. I caved. I sat them down and confessed everything. The 3 distinct doorbell rings on Friday, the confrontation on Saturday, the sprint from the street, and the terrifying sight of her face bent sideways against the glass window. As the story unfolded, the reaction from my parents was completely unexpected. They didn't look angry, and they didn't seem particularly concerned about a crazy local woman terrorizing the property. Instead, both of their faces drained of color, and they looked physically sick to their stomachs. They were terrified of the specific names she had uttered. They were terrified that she had asked about Mr. Walker and Joe. I had simply assumed those were the random, incoherent ramblings of a dementia patient who had wandered away from a care facility. But as my father sat there, staring at the table, he decided it was finally time to tell me the dark history of the house we lived in. He explained that when they purchased this house when I was just 5 years old, they had managed to secure it for a shockingly low price, well below market value. The reason for the massive discount was a horrific tragedy. The previous owner, a man plagued by severe mental illness, had brutally murdered his wife in the master bedroom before turning the weapon on himself. His name was Joe. I sat there, completely paralyzed, listening to my father's words. The old woman had stood on my porch laughing, claiming she could still hear Joe whispering inside the house. I tried to desperately calm my racing heart by rationalizing it. Surely, this old woman was just a former neighbor or a distant relative of the tragic couple who had suffered a psychological break and returned to a familiar place. I wished with everything in my soul that the revelation ended there. But things were about to get infinitely more disturbing. As I sat there trying to process the horrific reality of Joe, my dad leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, and told me there was a second part to the history. He explained that the reason we had abruptly packed up and moved out of our very first house when I was 5 years old wasn't due to a job relocation, as they had always told me. It was because our family was being systematically terrorized by a deeply dangerous, unidentified stalker. This man, who would call our home phone at all hours of the night breathing heavily and leaving horrific threats, referred to himself exclusively as Mr. Walker. My dad explained that Mr. Walker would show up on our old doorstep in the middle of the night, continuously rattling the door handles and trying to force his way inside. My parents called the authorities dozens of times, but because the man always vanished into the woods before the police arrived, they were completely powerless. My dad, who used to be an avid hunter, eventually resorted to staying up all night in the living room with his hunting rifle, waiting for the perimeter to be breached. One night, Mr. Walker successfully shattered the backsliding glass door and stepped into our home. My dad took a snapshot in the dark. He didn't know if he missed entirely or hit the intruder in the shoulder, but the man let out a horrific scream and fled into the tree line. My dad never saw him again. We packed up our entire life and moved into our current house just a few weeks later. And that extreme, terrifying ordeal was the exact reason why my parents became so profoundly, pathologically strict with my upbringing. It took me months to even begin to process the weight of what my parents had hidden from me. I felt a deep, burning anger that they had kept me in the dark for so long, but as I grew older, I came to understand their desperate desire to protect my innocence. Yet, 16 years have passed since that terrifying weekend with Ethan, and I am still left scratching my head in absolute confusion and dread. We still have absolutely no clue who that elderly woman was. We have no idea how a random stranger standing on our porch could have possibly known the intimate, dark secrets of both our current home's history and the terrifying moniker of the stalker who hunted my family across state lines over a decade prior. The old woman never came back. I have long since moved out of my parents' house and built a life of my own. But whenever I return to visit them for the holidays, I find myself standing by those same living room bay windows late at night, staring out into the empty, quiet suburban street, wondering where she went and what she truly was. Sometimes, I wonder if my family carries some kind of dark, magnetic curse. I just hope with all my heart that whatever heavy, dark clouds have followed us for all these years have finally vanished for good.